In 2007, a young girl vanished while walking home from school in rural Oregon. Her pink backpack later found tangled in the roots of an ancient oak tree. For years, the case went cold until a curious 10-year-old stumbled upon something buried deep beneath that same tree. What he uncovered would shatter everything the quiet town thought it knew and expose a darkness no one was ready to face. Michael Langston wasn't supposed to be playing alone that afternoon, but at 10 years old, he had already learned how to slip past rules when nobody was looking. The autumn sun had begun its slow descent behind the thick canopy of maple and hickory trees that guarded the outskirts of Terry Hollow, a quiet New England town tucked deep in the cradle of routine and fear. His backyard, a generous stretch of unkempt grass, faded into a wood line the town referred to in hushed tones as Old Ridge. It had been off limits for as long as Micah could remember. His mother used to call it the haunted forest. His father, who rarely spoke about the past, only ever said, "Stay clear of that place. Bad things grow where silence settles." But that day, the world was full of wind and challenge. With no one watching, Micah had taken his soccer ball and turned the yard into a one-man tournament. He dribbled across invisible lines, muttered the names of imaginary teammates, and lined up for a final triumphant kick that, in his mind, would secure the championship for the Langston Lions. He struck the ball harder than intended, sending it soaring past the firewood pile, over the weathered garden fence, and into the shadows of Old Ridge. It disappeared without a sound. Micah stood frozen, heart thumping with a familiar cocktail of thrill and dread. His mom would yell, his dad would just stare, that quiet disappointment worse than any punishment. And yet, as he approached the edge of the forest, the air felt different, thicker, older, and weighted by something unspoken. The first line of trees seemed to lean inward, not quite welcoming, but not pushing him away either. He took a breath, stepped over the property line, and followed the gentle slope of the land down toward where he thought the ball might have landed. Dry leaves crunched under his sneakers, and with each step, the world seemed to dull, the wind grew still, the birds silent. Even the ever-present drone of distant traffic faded into a hush. The forest held its breath. After 5 minutes of searching, Micah saw it. His soccer ball sat lopsided near the gnarled base of a massive oak tree, half hidden beneath curled leaves and earth. As he approached, something else caught his eye, a torn strip of fabric wedged between the twisted roots. It was faded, almost gray, but its pattern hinted at a design that had once been vibrant, like something a child might wear. He hesitated, glancing aware of how alone he was. The forest loomed, ancient and quiet. Curiosity outweighed caution. Michael crouched, pulling gently at the fabric. It came loose with a soft rip, revealing more beneath, a corner of a weathered canvas, perhaps a backpack, barely visible under the soil. His breath hitched. He touched it, then jerked his hand back, his fingers trembling. It wasn't just a piece of old cloth. It was buried, hidden, forgotten. At that moment, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. Just a branch, he told himself, just the wind. But his body moved before his mind could argue. He snatched the soccer ball, fabric still clutched in his other hand, and bolted toward home, not daring to look back. That evening, as dusk fell over Terry Hollow and the world turned blue with shadow, Micah sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the cloth in his hands. It felt wrong to have it, like it didn't want to be taken. But it also felt important, vital, as if it had waited years for someone to find it. He didn't tell his parents, not yet. Instead, he folded the fabric carefully, slid it under his mattress, and lay awake long after his house had gone still. The roots of Old Ridge whispered in his dreams that night, voices without words, stories without faces, and for the first time in his life, Micah wondered what truly happened in those woods 16 years ago. Micah didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house made him startle. Every rustle of the wind outside sent a chill through his limbs. He kept seeing the twisted roots of that oak tree, the way they wrapped around the fabric as if trying to keep it hidden from the world. The next morning, while his parents were still asleep, and crept back toward Old Ridge. This time he brought a small trowel from the garden shed, the same one his mother used to pot flowers. The forest didn't feel as still as the day before. It felt aware, somehow watching. He retraced his steps until the oak came into view, its wide trunk like a sentinel guarding secrets. The roots were exactly where he left them, but now the cloth lay folded beneath a rock he'd placed there the previous day, a strange sense of protection washing over him when he'd retrieved it. With a deep breath, he knelt and began to dig. The soil was moist and dense, clinging to the edges of the trowel as he worked in silence. A few inches down, something resisted the blade. He switched to using his fingers, pulling away clumps of dirt until more fabric became visible. It wasn't just a strip. It was part of a sleeve, a cuff frayed at the end. Micah gently uncovered the rest and soon found a panel of faded brown cotton, barely intact but unmistakably part of a child's school uniform. Broad color was odd, an old-fashioned tan, almost like something from a sepia photograph. But what made his breath catch was the crack on the pocket. It was cracked and worn, but still legible. A shield with an open book and a dove. He'd seen that symbol once before in an old photo album in his grandmother's attic. It belonged to South Haven Elementary School, the one that had closed down after that terrible year. The same year the girl disappeared. Becca Lynn. Her name floated into his mind unbidden. His father had mentioned it once during an argument with a neighbor, thinking Michael wasn't listening. He had been. Micah sat back, the trowel dangling loosely in his hand. This was real. This wasn't a kid's imagination. He turned his attention to the hole, now about a foot deep. Something else glinted faintly beneath the soil, reflecting the weak morning light. He leaned in, brushed more dirt away, and uncovered what looked like the top edge of a plastic backpack. It was coated in grime and partially collapsed under the weight of the earth, but its shape was intact. It took several minutes to free it completely, and when he finally pulled it up, his arms trembled from both effort and nerves. The backpack was pale pink, the kind with cartoon butterflies faded along the seams, and the zipper was jammed halfway open. With trembling hands, he tugged it open and peeked inside. The smell was faint but sour, like old mildew and something far more unsettling. He emptied the contents carefully, a plastic pencil case cracked and empty, a small flashlight without batteries, a faded keychain shaped like a star, and finally, a thin notebook with water-stained edges. The cover was bent, the pages inside crinkled and warped, but one page near the front had been written in thick, looping handwriting with a purple gel pen. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still readable. "If I disappear, it's not an accident." Micah stared at the sentence, his mouth dry. He read it again, slower this time, and then again, as if repetition would make it less terrifying. The words weren't scribbled in fear, they were deliberate, as though the writer had taken her time. He turned the page and found drawings, childlike sketches of trees, a house with no windows, a bed with something hiding underneath it. There were no names, but one page toward the middle had a heart drawn in pink, and inside it, in shaky letters, B. Lynn? His hands shook as he held the notebook, afraid to read more, yet unable to stop. He flipped through pages, some filled with what looked like diary entries, but were too smudged to read. One, however, stood out. The handwriting was larger, more rushed. "They think no one will find me. But the tree knows. I left my voice here." Micah's heart pounded in his chest. He looked around the clearing, suddenly unsure if he was truly alone. Every tree seemed to lean a little closer, every leaf's movement suddenly suspicious. He stuffed the items back into the backpack, zipped it up with effort, and stood. He didn't know what to do next. Bring it to his parents, the police, but how would he explain being in Oldridge in the first place? And what if whoever they were still didn't want Becca to be found? He took one last glance at the roots of the oak, their twisted shapes now looking almost like fingers. A shiver ran through him. This wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. This was something buried, literally and metaphorically. Someone had hidden her story, and for 16 years it had waited right here underfoot. But the backpack wasn't the only thing in that soil. The way the roots had clung to the uniform, the way the earth gave up the notebook like a reluctant confession, it felt like there was more, something deeper. Something still breathing just beneath the surface. Micah sprinted back through the woods with the weight of the backpack dragging heavily from his shoulder, the once soft pink straps now stiff with grime. The edges of the forest blurred as adrenaline pulsed through him, the air sharp and cold in his lungs, carrying the scent of moss and secrets. By the time he stumbled into his backyard, mud on his jeans and leaves in his hair, the sun had climbed higher into the sky, casting long morning shadows across the fence. He didn't stop until he was inside the house, dropping the backpack just beyond the threshold of the laundry room. His mother, Hannah Langston, stood at the kitchen counter, her back to him as she prepared lunch. The sharp scent of lemon cleaner mingled with the warmth of cooking bacon, grounding the air in ordinary domesticity, a sharp contrast to the unease settling in Micah's chest. "Mom," he called, voice trembling despite his best effort to sound casual, "I found something, in the woods." Hannah turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, eyebrows raised in amusement first, then concern, as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Micah, what on earth? Where were you? You're filthy." She moved toward him, hands reaching out instinctively, but he took a step back, gesturing toward the backpack. "I was out by the old oak. I found this." There was stuff buried, clothes, a notebook. "It's important." Her eyes narrowed as she crouched to unzip the backpack, her movements careful, almost surgical. One by one, she pulled out the items, each one appearing less significant in the harsh light of day. The fabric, now dry and brittle, looked like nothing more than old cloth. The pencil case cracked open, revealing nothing. Even the notebook, once ominous in the quiet of the woods, seemed merely water-damaged and worn here under the hum of kitchen lights. Hannah sighed, clearly trying to keep her voice steady. "Micah, sweetie, this is probably just junk from a squatter or an old hiker. Homeless folks sometimes pass through near the tracks. They could have camped out there years ago. This isn't what you think." Micah's heart sank, the certainty he'd carried home now dissolving under the weight of her rational tone. But the symbol on the uniform. It was from South Haven, and the note, it said. She shook her head gently, brushing his bangs from his forehead with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Old schools donated clothes to shelters all the time, and kids write weird stuff in diaries. It doesn't mean anything sinister, baby." He stood frozen as she zipped the bag shut and moved it toward the garage door, clearly intending to throw it out, or at least hide it away. "Don't worry about it," she said, already returning to her skillet. "Go wash up, okay?" Micah didn't argue. He turned away, shame and frustration tightening in his throat, but instead of going to his room, he slipped into the hallway, opened the door to the basement stairs, and descended quietly. His grandfather, Thomas Langston, was in his usual spot near the wood-burning stove, sipping coffee from a mug that bore the chipped badge of the Terry Hollow Police Department. The room smelled of ash and cedar, and the low hum of a radio played softly in the background. Micah held the backpack to his chest as he approached. "Grandpa," he whispered. The old man looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age, a permanent furrow etched into his brow. "I need you to look at something." Thomas set down the mug and gestured him closer. As Micah laid out the items on the worn table between them, he noticed the old man's demeanor change. The moment the notebook appeared, Thomas froze. He reached out slowly, hands trembling slightly as he opened the cover. His breath caught. Micah watched, unsure, as Thomas flipped through the pages with the precision of someone both deeply familiar and deeply unsaddled. When he reached the page with the warning, "If I disappear, it's not an accident," he sat back in his chair, eyes clouded with something close to grief. "This is hers," he said finally, voice thick. "This is Becca's," Micah swallowed. "You know her?" Thomas nodded slowly, thumb resting on the edge of the notebook. "Becca Lynn. She was 9 when she vanished. 16 years ago. I was the first on the case." He tapped the initials scrawled in her heart. "She wrote like this. I remember it. She used to doodle on the corners of her library checkout slips. Always hearts. Always that weird tilted B." He looked up, the firelight catching the steel in his eyes. "Where did you find this?" Micah recounted everything. The ball, the roots, the fabric, the unearthed pack. With each word, Thomas's jaw tightened, the old gears of his mind clearly turning. "They closed the case after 2 years, said it was likely an abduction, maybe someone passing through on the highway. But we never found any trace. No blood, no witnesses, no body." He reached into a drawer beneath the table, pulling out a yellowing file folder. "I kept what they let me." Most of the records were sealed when the department changed hands. He flipped it open, revealing faded copies of missing posters, typed notes, photos of a bright night's job with a crooked smile. Micah leaned closer, his breath catching. It was her. The same girl who wrote in the notebook, the same girl whose voice had whispered through the oak. Thomas closed the folder and stared at the fire. If this came from Oldridge, we need to go back. But not yet. We need to think. He glanced toward the stairs. Your mom wouldn't understand. Not yet. Not until we know what else is down there. Micah nodded, the fear in his chest now mixed with a strange clarity. He had found something that mattered, and someone who believed him. But he also sensed that this was only the surface, that what lay beneath the soil of Oldridge would be darker, heavier, and far more dangerous than anything he'd imagined. Later that night, after Micah had gone to bed and the Langston house fell into its quiet nightly rhythm, Thomas Langston sat alone in the basement, the faded folder of Becca Lynn's case open before him. The flames in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the old wood paneling and the bad-shaped burn mark on the floor where he'd once dropped a lit cigar. His hands, though weathered and calloused, still moved with the precision of an investigator trained to find patterns in the noise. He stared at the last page of his copy, the official statement of case suspended pending further evidence, and felt a surge of bitterness rise in his throat. They hadn't just failed to solve Becca's disappearances, they had erased it, sanitized it, sealed it behind administrative procedure. But he hadn't forgotten, and neither had the trees. At 3:15 a.m., long after the streets of Terry Hollow had emptied and the only lights still burning were street lamps and porch bulbs, Thomas slid on his old brown sheriff's jacket, grabbed his keys, and stepped out into the fog. The Municipal Records Annex sat behind the old courthouse, a squat brick building with ivy-covered walls and a temperamental HVAC system. It used to be his second home. Now it felt like a mausoleum, cold, locked, and heavy with secrets. He still had a key, though technically it was supposed to be turned in after his retirement. No one had asked for it, and he hadn't offered. The lock clicked open without resistance. Inside, the air was thick with dust and disuse. Rows of metal filing cabinets and plastic tubs stretched into the dark like tombstones. He moved without turning on the overheads, relying on his flashlight and muscle memory. The Lynn case would have been categorized under 2 juvenile missing persons, 2000-2011. He found it easily, but when he slid the drawer open, a thick red stamp glared up at him from the folder tab. Intermirtha's only sealed by order of town council. His jaw tightened. He took the folder anyway. Back at home in the quiet refuge of his basement office, he opened the sealed file. What he saw confirmed a suspicion he had carried for years. Half of the expected contents were missing, photos gone, interviews redacted, timelines altered. It had been gutted, curated, but one item remained. A compact disc in a clear plastic sleeve marked Interview. 5 TLS files marked BLL, November 14th, 9. He slid it into his old desktop computer and turned the volume up. The interview began with familiar voices, his own, younger and more clipped, asking routine questions. Becca's voice came next, high and nervous, speaking in a whisper. He remembered that day clearly. She'd been found wandering near the highway 3 days before she disappeared again. She had refused to name anyone at first, then, near the end of the recording, she had finally started to speak names. And that's when it happened. As the file played, he leaned closer. Becca's voice trembled through the speakers. I didn't want to go back. He said if I told anyone he'd hurt Mom. But I saw his truck. I remember the smell. It was static, loud prolonged distortion, a digital stutter, then silence. The audio cut back in several seconds later, with Thomas's recorded voice asking, Are you sure it was him? But there was no indication of who him was. He rewound, played it again. Same result. The interference was too deliberate, too clean. Someone had scrubbed the name, not just muted it, scrubbed it. Overwritten that portion of the audio with synthetic static, likely during the file's archiving process. That meant someone in authority, someone with access, had manipulated official evidence. Not only that, but the metadata on the file showed a last modification date, March 2012, nearly 3 years after time. He hadn't seen that file since 2009. He stared at the screen, his reflection flickering over Becca's paused image. What had she tried to say? And why had they buried it? He clicked through the digital folder, but there were no backups. The system had been replaced in 2015, and most of the legacy archives had been transferred or destroyed. He looked again at the file box. A second disk sat beneath the first, unlabeled. Curious, he inserted it. A backup, maybe, but instead of an interview, it held only a low-resolution surveillance video from a traffic camera mounted outside the South Haven Elementary School. The date stamp read October 3, 2009, 3 weeks before Becca vanished. The video quality was poor, but as he scrubbed through the footage, he spotted a dark UCF pulling into frame. It paused beside the school gate for exactly 12 seconds, then backed out and disappeared. No one exited, no child entered, but the driver's side window rolled down briefly, just long enough for someone to look at the building. Thomas paused the video and squinted. He couldn't see the driver's face, but the build, the posture, the way the arm rested on the window, it was hauntingly familiar. His hand hovered over the print screen key, then stopped. Something wasn't right. He opened the municipal personnel directory from 2009, searched names, looked for anyone with an SUV of that model and year. The list was short, 6 people. One name stood out: Alan Barrick, councilman, oversight committee member, Becca's godfather. Thomas's stomach twisted. He pulled the folder close again, flipped through the few documents that remained. One memo, dated March 18, 2012, the same day as the file's last modification, was signed by Barrick. No mention of Becca's case, no mention of the name she had tried to say. But in the margins of the page, scribbled faintly in pencil, barely legible, was a note. BL tried to talk. Audio flagged for review. H, he froze. AH was Andrew Holloway, the same detective who had replaced Thomas after his retirement, a man he had never fully trusted, who had been brought in from out of town under the guise of fresh eyes, and who had conveniently closed more than a dozen unsolved cases in record time. Thomas sat back in his chair, the pieces spinning in his mind like shattered glass. Becca had named someone. The file had been tampered with. The council had sealed the record, and Holloway had signed off. The flame in the stove dimmed to embers as outside the first cold rain of fall began to tap against the windows, steady and unrelenting, like footsteps approaching through the dark. The next morning, before the fog had lifted and while the neighborhood still slept behind drawn curtains, Micah slipped on his hoodie and grabbed the notebook from under his bed, its warped pages now permanently bent from moisture and time. He hadn't told his mother about Grandpa Thomas's late-night visit, or the folder filled with secrets, nor had he mentioned the distorted audio or the name that was never spoken. What he had focused on was the page with the hand-drawn map, a series of childish lines scrawled beneath a sketch of a tree with roots spreading out like fingers, and beside it a smaller drawing of a house marked only with an X. At first glance, the markings seemed nonsensical, but when Micah had compared them with the real layout of Oldridge Woods, something had clicked. The curved line, resembling a stream, matched the creek behind the Langston property. The loop near the tree could be the old hunting trail. And the X? That was somewhere deeper, where the trees grew thicker and the air turned strangely. Micah moved quickly, retracing his steps from 2 days ago, but this time veering left at the old oak tree, using the markings like a primitive compass. The air was colder today, the wind threading through branches above like whispered warnings. His sneakers sank into damp earth, every step accompanied by the quiet squelch of soaked leaves. After nearly 20 minutes, he spotted it. Hidden behind a wall of overgrown shrubs and half-collapsed birch trunks stood a small structure, barely more than a skeleton of rotting wood and peeling paint. It leaned to one side, like it was too tired to stand. Ivy had crawled up its sides, gripping the boards like desperate fingers, and the roof sagged in the center, shingles scattered like fallen teeth. It was a cabin, or maybe it had once been, before time and the forest claimed it. Micah stepped forward cautiously. The front door hung from a single hinge, swinging lazily with each gust of wind. He pushed it open, the creak of wood echoing into the silence. Inside, the light filtered weakly through cracks in the walls, illuminating motes of dust that swirled with every movement. The room smelled of mold, rotted wood, and something faintly metallic. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he stepped inside, where furniture lay scattered: an overturned chair, a table missing 2 legs, a mattress whose stuffing had long since burst free and mouldered in clumps. But what caught his attention was the trapdoor in the corner, hidden beneath a warped rug patterned with cartoon stars. He peeled the rug back, revealing rusted hinges and a handle caked with grime. Heart thudding, Micah grabbed a nearby stick and pried the door open. It groaned as if protesting after years of stillness, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam trembling slightly as he aimed it downward. Wooden steps led into a small basement, carved roughly into the earth, with stone walls slick with moisture. He descended slowly, each step creaking under his weight, the air growing colder and thicker. At the bottom, the flashlight's beam swept across a room no larger than a garden shed. The walls were lined with shelves, most empty, but a few held the skeletal remains of long-forgotten items. A chipped ceramic bunny, a plastic cup with faded superhero logos, a child's sneaker hardened with age and mildew. In the far corner, nestled beneath a spiderweb-covered bench, lay a rusted metal lunchbox. Micah approached slowly, kneeling beside it. The lid bore the scratches of time, but was still readable. Etched crudely across the front was the year 2009, each number carved deep as if by a child's hand. He opened it. Inside lay a collection of small, haunting relics: a yellow crayon snapped in half, a pair of rusting barrettes shaped like butterflies, and a photograph so damaged by moisture it was barely visible. But the outline of a little girl's face remained, her smile smudged, her eyes unmistakably familiar from the missing posters. Next to the photo sat a folded piece of paper, stained and delicate. Micah carefully unfolded it. In the same purple gel pen that marked the notebook from the oak tree, the message read, "He said this would be our secret place. I didn't want to stay." Micah's fingers tightened around the paper as the reality of the space pressed in around him. The basement wasn't just a hiding place, it had been lived in. Not comfortably, not willingly, but someone had spent time here. The blanket tucked beneath the bench was small and threadbare, patterned with cartoon dogs, its edges gnawed and fraying. Beside it lay a doll missing one eye, its fabric skin stained with something darker than dirt. He scanned the room again, noting the markings scratched into the walls. Tallies, maybe days, maybe something else. A child had been here, alone, afraid, keeping count of something only they could understand. And no one had ever come. Micah reached for the flashlight again, aiming its beam across the rest of the basement. His breath caught as it landed on the far wall. Unlike the others, this one had been partially covered in cardboard, stapled into the wood as if to hide something. He stepped closer, pulled at the corner of the board, and it came loose in his hand. Behind it, scratched into the plaster with what looked like a nail, were words. "Dared forgot me." Beneath that, a series of dates. The last one was November 16th, 2009. Micah's skin prickled. That was the day Becca Lynn was officially declared missing. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping on a box near his foot. He picked it up. Inside were more drawings, curled from moisture, each one a portrait of a girl with wide eyes, drawn over and over again, with increasing distortion. The final one. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out, just scribbled black ink. The silence of the room pressed in tighter now. Micah stood still, holding the rusted lunchbox to his chest, and realized that this place had been forgotten, not by accident, but by design. Someone had brought Becca here. Someone had tried very hard to make sure no one would ever find it again. Micah emerged from the basement of the abandoned shack with the lunchbox tucked beneath his jacket, his heart pounding not from fear alone, but from the weight of what he now carried. The drawings, the toys, the etched walls, all of it pointed to a harrowing truth. Someone had kept Becca Lynn in that space, possibly for months, and no one had found it or come to look. He retraced his steps carefully, leaves crunching underfoot, eyes scanning the treetops, paranoid that someone or something might still be watching. He didn't stop running until he crossed the edge of the Langston backyard, breath catching in his throat as he slipped through the side door and into the basement, where Thomas was already waiting, the worn folder still spread across the table. Thomas stood abruptly when he saw the boy's face, and when Micah placed the rusted lunchbox on the table, the older man took a step back, whispering, My God! He opened it slowly, his hands gentle with age and dread. One look inside told him everything he needed to know. He dropped into his chair and closed his eyes for a long moment. This was real, he murmured, then looked up at Micah. We're not the only ones who saw pieces of this, Micah. There were others. There always are. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the line of trees and cast gold across the lawn, Thomas made a call to an old acquaintance, someone who had lived near the edge of Old Ridge Woods longer than anyone else, Wallace Murrow, a retired surveyor who had built his one-stormy brick cottage decades ago at the border where the woods began to thicken. By early evening, Micah and Thomas were sitting in Wallace's cramped living room, the scent of wood smoke and menthol lingering in the air. Wallace was a wiry man in his late 70s, sharp-eyed, despite the cloudiness that age had settled into his bones. He sat hunched over a mug of weak tea, one leg bouncing slightly with unspoken tension. "You said you remembered something," Thomas prompted gently. Wallace nodded, his fingers tightening around the ceramic. "Not remembered," he said. "Never forgot." He looked at Micah. "You said you found that shack, huh? South Trail past the old stream bend?" Micah nodded, and Wallace took a shaky breath. "Well then, maybe I ain't crazy after all." He turned his gaze toward the window, as if seeing into the past. That girl went missing back in '09? The woods changed. Used to be lively, kids played, dogs wandered, hikers passed through. But then, it got quiet. Real quiet. Except for the lights. Thomas leaned forward. "What kind of lights?" Wallace exhaled slowly. "Flashlights, or lanterns, maybe both, flickering in and out of the trees, always at night, usually around 11 or midnight, and always in the same stretch, near that crooked birch grove by the West Ridge. I saw them for almost a year, sometimes 3-4 times a week, never during the day." Micah frowned. "Did anyone else see them?" Wallace shook his head. "Told a few neighbors. They thought it was poachers, kids playing tricks, but I knew better. The movements were slow, deliberate, not kids, someone who didn't want to be seen." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Did you ever report it?" Wallace looked at him like the question stung. "Course I did. Called the station more than once. First time, they said someone would check it out. No one came. Second time, same promise. Nothing." He paused, his gaze suddenly direct. "Third time I went down there myself, to the station, demanded to talk to whoever was in charge that night." Thomas swallowed hard. "Who was it?" Wallace's expression darkened. "John Lynn, Becca's father." The room fell into silence, broken only by the slow creak of the old radiator heating up near Wallace's feet. "He was shift supervisor back then," Wallace continued. "Had access to the rotation, to the response logs. I remember walking into that office, and he looked calm, like he already knew what I was going to say. Told me they'd sent someone and found nothing. I asked to see the log. He said it had already been filed, case closed." Thomas looked down, gripping the edge of his chair. "That was the same week we got an anonymous tip about an abandoned car in the next county over. A car they said belonged to a woman who used to babysit Becca." Wallace nodded slowly. "And that's when the lights stopped, just gone, like whoever it was packed up and left." He looked again at Micah. "But the weirdest part? The first few times I saw those lights, I heard something too." Micah leaned forward, his breath catching. Wallace's voice dropped to a whisper. "A child crying." He closed his eyes, as if ashamed to speak it. "Just for a second, like a whimper caught in the wind. I told myself it was the foxes. You know how they sound sometimes. But deep down, I knew it wasn't." Thomas stood and paced the room, the revelations closing in like fog. So John Lynn, the girl's own father, was on duty during multiple calls, reporting suspicious activity in the very woods where his daughter vanished, and he didn't act. Wallace met his gaze. Or he acted exactly the way someone would if they didn't want those lights to be found. Micah sat still, the words sinking into his chest like stones. The stories were no longer just lines in a file. The lights, the crying, the trapdoor, the girl who tried to speak, and the town that never listened. He looked toward the darkening forest through the window and felt something else stir inside him. Not fear, not even anger, but something else stir inside him. Not fear, not even anger, but something else stir inside him. Not determination. Wallace sipped his tea again, eyes heavy with memory. "You said you found toys in that place." Mary Marvel stared into his cup. "I heard the lights one last time that year, November 15. One day before she was declared gone for good. I wonder now if that was the night they took her away, or if it was the night someone decided she wasn't coming back. Micah, we're not just chasing ghosts anymore. We're following footsteps, and they're leading straight to people who wanted them erased." Outside, the wind howled gently through the branches, and the first stars pierced the dusk above Oldridge, flickering like the lights Wallace once saw, like the truth just beginning to break through the trees. 2 days after the conversation with Wallace Murrow, Thomas Langston arranged a quiet meeting at the old community center near the edge of downtown Terry Hollow, a building that had once been part of the South Haven Elementary campus before the school was decommissioned. Time had not been kind to the place. The paint on the walls had peeled, the windows were yellowed with grime, and the air held the damp scent of paper and mildew. But today it served a different purpose. Thomas had reached out through an old contact list, searching for former staff of South Haven Elementary who had known Becca Lynn before her disappearances. Only one had responded. Her name was Miss Heather Klein, now retired, once a fourth-grade homeroom teacher with a reputation for stern compassion and meticulous records. She arrived wearing a long gray coat, her short silver hair tucked beneath a wool hat, her eyes sharp but weary as she stepped into the meeting room, her every movement measured by years of emotional caution. Thomas greeted her gently, offering her tea, which she declined with a polite shake of the head before seating herself across from him and Micah. "You said it was about Becca Lynn," she said without preamble. "I've waited 16 years to talk about that child." Again, Thomas nodded slowly. "We believe there are pieces of the story that were ignored, even erased. I need to know if you saw anything at all, that felt wrong before she disappeared." Heather exhaled deeply, her fingers tightening around the handles of her purse. "Becca was bright, curious, a little quiet but observant. She drew a lot, always kept to herself during recess. She had this way of looking at people, not just seeing them, but seeing through them." She paused, but toward the end, something changed. Micah leaned forward, heart thudding. "Changed how?" Heather glanced at the boy, then back to Thomas. "She started showing up with bruises. Not every day, not obvious ones, but enough that I noticed. On her forearms, her collarbone, once near her left eye. I remember thinking it looked like someone had grabbed her. I filed a preliminary concern report and flagged it to the nurse." Thomas's jaw clenched. "What did they do?" Heather's face hardened. "They told me not to submit it officially, said it had already been reviewed, that someone had spoken to the family and everything was in hand. I asked for documentation. There wasn't any. Just a verbal assurance from the principal's office. Later that week, I found out that Mr. Lynn, Becca's father, was on the school board's disciplinary advisory panel." Micah's stomach twisted. "So he could have shut it down?" He nodded. "And not just that. After my second report, I got a warning. A formal note about overstepping boundaries. They said Becca was being homeschooled more frequently, and that any absences or behavioral notes were to be cleared through administrative review before being recorded." She looked down, her voice soft. "That had never happened before. I'd taught there 15 years. Thomas frowned. "Did she ever talk to you directly?" Heather hesitated. "Not in words, but she drew things, strange things. Once during art period she turned in a piece titled, 'The Place No One Hears Me Cry.' I remember it because it made me feel cold," Micah whispered. "Do you still have it?" Heather reached into her purse and withdrew a yellowed folder, sliding it across the table. "I kept a few things when the school shut down. Some of Becca's work felt different. I couldn't throw it away." Thomas opened a folder carefully. Inside were 5 or 6 crumpled sheets, each with childlike pencil sketches. One showed a little girl curled in a corner, surrounded by high, dark trees. Another depicted a small building, barely more than a box, with no windows, only a crooked roof and a single door. Above it, in shaky capital letters, were the words, No one here. On the next drawing, the same house stood alone, with jagged lines all around it, like sound waves drawn in reverse, meant not to project, but to trap. Micah turned the final page and saw the drawing Heather had mentioned. A shack nearly identical to the one in the woods stood at the center. Behind it were trees, and above the roof, scribbled in the same purple gel ink as the notebook entries, were the words, "The place where I stay when I'm bad." Thomas closed the folder slowly. This isn't just a scared child. This is someone trying to speak. Heather nodded, her voice quiet but firm. She was begging, but not with her mouth, with what she thought we'd notice, and we didn't. Micah's chest burned. You said she was homeschooled more at the end. Heather pursed her lips. Yes. That last month she missed almost 2 weeks in a row. When she returned, she was different. Not just quiet. She wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. She stopped drawing people, only walls, doors, She looked toward the window. And then she was gone. Thomas leaned back, the weight of the folder heavier than its pages. And nobody followed up? Heather's expression turned bitter. After the fire drill that afternoon, when the alarm went off and the school was evacuated, they said she'd left early. Her father had signed her out, but I never saw a signature sheet. When I asked, the file had already been updated. When I pushed, I was told to drop it. Micah asked quietly. Who told you? Heather's eyes met his. Principal Darrell McLean, same man who approved Becca's father to chair the advisory panel. She paused. McLean retired the year after, moved out of state. Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already pulling names, timelines, positions. Do you know if anyone else ever raised concerns? Heather shook her head. If they did, they kept quiet. No one wanted to challenge the board, not when it involved one of their own. Micah opened the folder again, studying the drawings with fresh clarity. The pictures weren't just metaphors, they were maps, warnings, histories encoded in a child's hand. He looked up at Thomas. She showed us. We just didn't see it. Thomas's eyes didn't leave the page. We see it now. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches along the sidewalk, and the shadows inside the room shifted, pressing softly against the glass, as if waiting for the truth to finally step outside and be heard. The drawings haunted Thomas Langston for days after the meeting with Heather Klein. Each stroke of Becca's pencil, each scribbled word, had become evidence more damning than any confession, and it was no longer just a matter of forgotten oversight. It was concealment, deliberate, systematic. As he sat late one evening in his basement office, the drawings spread beside his notes. He returned to the one name that kept reappearing, directly and indirectly, John Lynn. The girl's father, a former volunteer board member, the man who had been on duty the night Wallace reported strange lights in the woods, and the same man who somehow had the power to silence concern reports and override documentation. Thomas opened his laptop and accessed a secure law enforcement database using old credentials he had never fully relinquished. Credentials he'd told no one he still possessed. What he found next changed everything. John Lynn's record was surprisingly clean, too clean. Almost every entry was either a public accolade or a harmless administrative note, but Thomas knew how to read between the lines. In the internal-only counter, sections restricted to supervisors and filtered through personnel channels, he found a flagged report dated May 2007, 2 years before Becca's disappearance. The report had been submitted anonymously by a female officer in community services. It claimed that John had been observed behaving inappropriately with a juvenile during a community fair, placing a hand too long on the girl's back, whispering something that caused her to cry, then quickly ushering her away. The complaint had triggered a brief investigation, but the final note in the file read, "Lack of corroborating evidence, witness uncooperative. Case closed by Supervisor A. Lynn." Thomas blinked. A. Lynn. Andrew Lynn, John's younger brother. He'd crossed the staff directory from 2007. Sure enough, Andrew Lynn had served as South Haven Elementary's acting principal from 2006 to 2010. He'd quietly resigned in the months following Becca's disappearances and relocated to rural Vermont. Thomas stared at the screen. Becca's father had been accused of misconduct, the case shut down by his own brother, and both of them had held positions of authority over the very place where Becca had studied, lived, and, Thomas was now certain, suffered. He needed more. Digging deeper, he found archived property records, zoning files, and employment documents. The old ranger cabin in Old Ridge Woods had once been part of a conservation grant issued to the school district in the early 2000s, meant for field trips and educational programs. The structure had fallen out of use and been decommissioned in 2006. Officially, the cabin was listed as condemned, padlocked, and logged under a closure report signed by none other than Principal Andrew Lynn. A maintenance note added, "Only key issued to administrative office for safety. Key assigned to site supervisor A. Lynn." Thomas stood slowly, the information coursing through him like ice. Andrew Lynn had sole access to the shack. No one else, not even forest rangers, had the key. If someone had wanted to use that cabin to hide something, or someone, he could have done so without ever leaving a trace. And John Lynn? He had every reason to protect that secret, every ability to silence those who questioned it. The next morning, under the pretense of visiting the Public Records Office, Thomas took Micah along and made a detour through the archives of the old district office building, now used for record storage. It took him nearly an hour, but eventually he found what he was looking for, an emergency access ledger used to track keys, tools, and building codes for school properties. He flipped through the logbook, scanning page after page until he reached the year 2009. On October 28, 2 weeks before Becca vanished, an entry noted, "Cabin key withdrawn. A. Lynn, field site prep for possible student use." Parents stood by him, reading over his shoulder. So he checked out the key before she disappeared. Thomas nodded grimly. "And there's no record of it ever being returned." He turned the page, but it ended there. No follow-up, no audit, just a quiet disappearance of an asset no one was watching. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the page. That afternoon, they returned to the basement and began assembling a new board of connections. Photos, names, articles, copies of Becca's drawings, and now a list of connections too precise to be coincidence. Thomas placed John Lynn and Andrew Lynn at the top, drawing a red line between them, and then branching out to South Haven Elementary, the school board, and finally the shack in Old Ridge. Micah stared at the lines, the shapes, the crisscross of secrets. If Andrew had the key and John was blocking the reports, they were working together. Thomas's voice was flat, or at least one way was covering for the other. Micah pointed to the folder of drawings. But why? Why keep her hidden like that? Why not just— He couldn't finish the thought. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a separate file, the copy of the missing persons bulletin. Becca's mother died in a car accident 2 years before she disappeared. A quiet case, nothing suspicious at the time, but what if it wasn't an accident? What if someone wanted Becca isolated, vulnerable? He tapped the side of the photo. We keep thinking of this like a disappearance. But what if it was custody just— Micah's stomach churned. You think her father was keeping her there as punishment? Or worse? Thomas looked him dead in the eyes. I think there is more than one person in this town who knew she was there. I think Andrew helped cover it up, and I think John made sure no one ever got close enough to hear her scream. The words hung in the air like smoke. Micah stepped back, overwhelmed, his eyes drifting to the drawing of the shack, drawn by a girl desperate to be found, hidden by men who were supposed to protect her. The past wasn't buried. It had been locked away, key in hand, by those who smiled in public and whispered in private. And the worst part, they weren't done hiding. The following week, Thomas submitted the lunchbox, the drawings, the rusted barrettes, and fragments of fabric to a trusted former colleague now working quietly in the forensics unit of a regional lab 2 counties over. It took some convincing, a quiet promise of confidentiality, and a long story that omitted names but emphasized urgency. What Thomas didn't say but fully believed was that buried in those artifacts was not only the voice of a forgotten child, but also a clue to something much broader, perhaps a pattern long ignored. When the results came back 10 days later, his breath caught before he even opened the email. There were 2 confirmed DNA matches. One was expected, Becca Lynn, present in the fibers of the blanket, in a hair follicle stuck inside the doll's fabric, in the faint trace left behind on the edge of the lunchbox's clasp. The other was not. The second sample, run against national databases, belonged to a girl named Lily Carpenter who had vanished from a rest stop near I-87 12 years ago during a family road trip from Pennsylvania to Maine. Her case had gone cold, widely assumed to be the result of a traveling predator or random abduction. No trace of her had ever been found until now, and somehow her DNA was inside the same basement where Becca Lynn had once been kept. Thomas stared at the screen, the two names side by side, his hands clenched into fists. He called Micah down to the basement immediately, showed him the report, and waited for the gravity of it to settle. Micah read the names aloud slowly, then whispered, "They weren't just hiding Becca. They used that place before." Thomas nodded grimly, or more than once, and possibly not just for her. He pulled out a printout of missing girls in the tri-state area from the past 20 years, a grim list he had started compiling on his own. Lily Carpenter had never been connected to Terry Hollow. Her disappearance was logged nearly 200 miles away, but now she was here. Or had been long enough to leave behind DNA to show who else was in that shack. Thomas. As they pieced together the timeline, one fact resurfaced from Thomas's old field notes. John Lynn, Becca's father, had vanished from Terry Hollow 10 years ago. Officially, it was ruled an accidental disappearance during a solo hunting trip. He had reportedly gone into the mountains east of town for a weekend, never returned, and his body was never recovered. The only thing found was his truck, abandoned at a trailhead, the keys still in the ignition, a half-packed cooler in the back seat. At the time, it had been labeled a tragedy, and many in town mourned him as a victim of the wilderness. But now, with everything else unraveling, Thomas looked back at that report with fresh eyes. He contacted a retired search and rescue team lead who had worked the original recovery effort. The man remembered the case well, if only because of how incomplete it felt. "We found the truck," he recalled, "but no blood, no prints beyond his, not even tracks. It was like he stepped out and vanished into the air. But here's what bothered me. No animals had touched the food. It was fresh. Cooler still cold, like he'd only left it minutes before." Thomas asked whether there had been any off-the-record theories. The man hesitated, then said some of the guys thought maybe he wasn't lost at all. Maybe he staged it. Fueling the theory were scattered rumors that began to emerge within the year following John's disappearance. People from nearby towns, truck stops, and border areas reported seeing a man who resembled him, older, with dyed hair or a beard, sometimes going by the name Joel Henry or Jack Lyons. One waitress in Vermont claimed he used a Pennsylvania license, always paid cash, and never stayed more than 2 days in any motel. Another in Ohio described him as real polite, too polite, like he was trying too hard not to be remembered. None of these sightings had ever been confirmed, but when Thomas pulled John's old DMV photo and used modern facial aging software, the resemblance was undeniable. If he was alive, he had changed everything but his eyes. Micah, reading through the testimonies, asked quietly, "Why run if no one was even coming for him?" Thomas answered without looking up. Guilt, or fear, or maybe someone did start asking questions and he got ahead of it. They traced more connections. John's brother Andrew now living under a new name in Vermont. The cabin key never returned. The overwritten audio tape where Becca had tried to name someone. Every clue pushed them closer to something deeply organized, perhaps even ritualized. Not just one girl hidden for silence, but a cycle. A method. Micah pointed to the timeline. Lily disappeared in 2011. Becca was taken in 2006. What if they weren't the only ones? Thomas's face darkened. Then we need to find that shack's full history. Who built it? Who had access? What other names passed through the log? Micah tapped on the photo of the lunchbox. And what if someone knew we were getting close? What if that's why John disappeared? Thomas hesitated. Or didn't disappear, just changed locations, started over. They reached out to an online private investigation network using encrypted forums, quietly posting fragments of the story with altered details, and within 48 hours, a retired private investigator in New Hampshire responded with a chilling photo, a man who looked eerily like John Lynn, captured on a gas station camera 2 months ago in rural Vermont, filling up an old truck registered under the name Jackson Lear. They reached out to an arrest warrant, no red flags, just a man who shouldn't exist anymore, buying coffee and driving west, like a ghost learning to walk in daylight. Michael whispered, "He's still out there." Thomas narrowed his eyes. and I think he knows we're watching." At that moment, the power flickered in the basement, just long enough for the monitors to blink and the lights to stutter before stabilizing. Thomas and Micah froze. The creak upstairs snapped Thomas and Micah into silence, their eyes locking in shared alarm. Thomas moved first, gesturing for Micah to stay low while he crept to the basement stairwell and listened. After a few tense seconds, he whispered, "Probably just the house settling," but they both knew it hadn't sounded like the house. It had been too precise, too deliberate. They remained in the basement for another hour, lights low, until they were certain no one was watching, or at least not anymore. By morning, the fear had settled into something else: urgency. They needed to finish what they had started. There was only one place left that held answers they hadn't yet uncovered: the oak tree where this had all begun. They returned to Oldridge Woods at dawn, the air damp with dew and tension, each step muffled by the soft decay of leaves. The forest was colder now, quieter. Even the birds seemed absent, as if nature itself had grown cautious. Thomas carried a spade and forensic gloves. Micah held a backpack with evidence bags and a small portable recorder. They arrived at the base of the oak, the same twisted roots where Micah had first found Becca's decaying backpack. He pointed to a depression in the ground that neither of them had noticed before, masked by a tangle of ivy and earth, now slightly sunken, as though the ground had begun to give in under time's slow pressure. Thomas began to dig. The first layers were easy: soft soil, broken roots, stones. But about 2 feet down, the resistance changed. The spade struck something dense, fibrous. He set the tool aside and used gloved hands to sweep away the soil. Moments later, strands of hair emerged, long, dark, matted, into the dirt. Micah gasped, but didn't look away. Further beneath, fragments of decaying fabric clung to brittle bones, small ribs, the curved edge of a jaw, the fragment of a shoulder blade. They stopped digging. Thomas called in a trusted contact from the county coroner's office, and within the hour, a discreet forensic team had arrived, flagged the site, and began a controlled recovery. The remains were confirmed to belong to a juvenile female, approximately aged 9 to 11, estimated time of death between 2009 and 2011. The DNA results took 3 days to return. Becca Lynn and Lily Carpenter. Both girls had died beneath the tree, side by side. There had been no escape, no final rescue, only silence and soil. Thomas sat with Micah on the back porch the night they received the confirmation. The weight of it was enormous, like history itself had exhaled into their bones. The following day, investigators returned to the site to complete the dig. It was there, buried deeper beneath the bodies, inside a rusted steel lunchbox wedged under a thick root, that they found the cassette. Miniature. Labeled in purple ink with a single word, "Plea." The tape had degraded badly, but the team managed to salvage the audio. They played it in Thomas's basement, just the two of them, the recorder resting between them like a relic from another world. The voice that crackled through the static was soft, broken by long pauses, and unmistakably that of a child. "If you find this," Becca whispered, "I hope you're kind. I hope you're not like him. He said I had to stay here to be better. He said Lily didn't listen, and that's why she couldn't leave. He brings food sometimes, not every day. He says the world isn't ready for girls like us. That we ruin things." A long silence. Then, more softly, "If someone hears this, my dad isn't who he says. He smiles when people look. He cries when I scream. But not because he's sad." Another pause, and then the final line, so quiet Thomas had to replay it 3 times before they understood. "If I disappear, it's not an accident. He's not who you think." When the tape ended, neither spoke for a long time. Micah reached over and pressed stop. "She tried to tell us," he said, voice shaking. "She left proof, buried it, like she knew no one would believe her." Thomas nodded. "She gave us everything she had, and it was enough." The story broke the following week. Thomas handed over every piece of evidence to the district attorney's office, ensuring the investigation would be reopened, this time publicly. News spread quickly. The remains were identified, the location confirmed. The connection between John Lynn, Andrew Lynn, and the 2 missing girls became the focal point of a multi-state probe. Tips poured in. Witnesses who had stayed silent began speaking. The last known sighting of Jackson Lear came from a bus station in Nebraska 2 months prior. An active warrant was issued. Faces of the missing were aired across the country. Becca's funeral was held on a windy Thursday, quiet and dignified. Thomas and Micah stood near the back, not speaking, simply watching as the casket was lowered into the ground beneath a young maple. The community, long silent, now stood shoulder to shoulder, some in grief, others in guilt. A girl forgotten by the system was finally laid to rest, not as a ghost, but as a daughter, a student, a voice finally heard. That evening, Micah sat beneath the same oak tree, legs folded, palms on the ground. He listened to the wind weaving through the leaves, and for the first time since that summer began, he felt still. Not safe, not healed, but still. He pulled out Becca's notebook, the last page fluttering in the breeze. It read simply, "One day, someone will hear me." If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping mysteries based on real disappearances and hidden truths. I'm curious, what part of Becca's story hit you the hardest? Do you think someone else in town knew all along? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one.